Hello, reading friend, and thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with Ravenna, Capital of Empire, Crucible of Europe by Judith Herrin. This book was originally published in 2020 in the UK and then shortly thereafter in the US. This edition that I read, which is this really nice hardcover edition with this mosaics here on the cover that Ravenna is famous for. But, I wanted to read Ravenna. I really like these biographies of cities, and I've read several over the last few years, and I've chatted several on my channel. Istanbul, book on Jerusalem, Washington, D.C., as well as a book called Roman Jerusalem that was basically the experience of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, during the Roman period and its relationship to Rome, and sort of comparing the two cities and their interaction, and that was really interesting. I will link to all of those chats down in the details below if you're interested in checking out those other book city chats that I've done. The Roman Jerusalem book, there was actually some instance from that book that ended up reappearing in this book, so I'll talk about that more in depth here in a bit. But yeah, Ravenna, so Capital of Empire, Crucible of Europe. This is concerning Ravenna in a very specific time frame. This book covers from about 402, the year 402 AD, until the earliest or first half, we'll say, of the 800s of the 9th century. So it goes from the time that the Roman Empire is still in existence, the Western Roman Empire is still in existence in the year 402. It's currently in 402, it's based in Milan. It's no longer, the seat of power is no longer really Rome, it's in Milan, what is today Milan. But in 402, Milan was getting threatened by Goths. The Goth invasions were occurring, and so Milan was not as easily defensible, right? So they decided to move the capital of the Western Roman Empire to a new location, and they chose Ravenna. Ravenna is on the northeast coast of Italy, and it is it's sort of in a marshy area, so it's really hard to approach by land, and then could be defended by sea. It didn't have a port itself, but it has a sort of a sister city next to it that did have a port, so those two sort of sister cities right there together. But the decision was made by I think it was the Emperor Theodosius, decides to move the empire to Ravenna in the year 402, and that's basically where this book starts. It goes then all the way through for about 400 years, maybe a little bit over 400 years, basically to the reign of Charlemagne, the Frankish king Charlemagne. So it covers this period of time, sort of when the Western Roman Empire is still in existence, the Eastern Empire is still going fairly strong, and then lots of things happen in that 400-year time span. I just have a summary here of the timeline, so I thought it might be helpful to sort of just go through that. So Ravenna was the capital of the Western Roman Empire from 402 until the empire collapsed in 476. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. It then served as the capital of the Ostrogothic kingdom until it was reconquered in 540 by the Byzantine Empire. Afterwards, the city formed the center of the Byzantine Exarchate of Ravenna, which is sort of a religious center, but it was also a center of power, until the invasion of the Lombards in 751. So, and then after the Lombards, that's sort of when the Frankish kings then are rising to power. They're allied with the popes in Rome, and to sort of combat the Lombards. And so that's sort of where the Frankish kings come in, Charlemagne, and in the 800s then, and that's sort of where this history of this city ends. But yeah, I just find this region, the Eastern Mediterranean, fascinating. I love the history of cities in general, and then I also love sort of this early Christianity, history of this period of time in Christianity when things are still not quite settled as far as the Christianity we know today, or know from history. And the power structure of the papacy in Rome was still being developed during this period, as well as dogma and what would later become Christian sort of dogma around things like the Trinity. And I'll talk more about that also here in a bit. So, 402. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of frame this chat a little bit with some of the interesting sort of things that happened that I took away from the book. The first one is really Gala Placidia. She was the daughter of Theodosius, the emperor, and we're talking about the early 400s, and she ends up getting taken hostage by the Goths. And she's with them for several years. She winds up marrying one of them, and then she has a son with him, but then he dies a few years later, so it doesn't last all that long. But she then moves to Ravenna. She ends up being this really a huge power player of the Western Roman Empire, still in existence. But remember, the Western Roman Empire goes really the last Roman emperor ends his reign in 476. So this period of the early 400s through 476. After 476, there are no more Western emperors, but there are still Eastern emperors in Constantinople. And the influence of Constantinople continues on. That's one of the main things I took away from this book, is that the influence of Constantinople continued on, and they thought of themselves as Rome. Today we think of the period once the Western Roman emperors ceased to exist in 476, we start to think of Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire as being Byzantium, or being, the Byzantine Empire. And that, as it occurred, wasn't quite so cut and dry. They still thought of themselves as Rome, based in Constantinople, and the Eastern Roman Empire emperors still had a lot of power in what was the Western Empire, or at least the core part of it, Italy. That sort of core part of it. So I thought that was really interesting, and that's something that I took away from the book. But so Theoderic. So I wanted to talk a bit about Theoderic and the Goths, because in 476, so the Goths end up replacing. So once the Western Roman emperors were no longer there, they're sort of broken up into different sort of kingdoms, and the Gothic kingdom was then based in Ravenna, and the king there was Theoderic. He did have the approval of Constantinople, so Ravenna became sort of this door for Constantinople, because remember, it's on the eastern side of Italy. From Constantinople could be reached by water very easily, and then Constantinople and the Eastern Empire still maintained its influence through Italy in this way. And one way was through this alliance with Theoderic, the Gothic emperor, the Gothic king. One interesting thing about the Goths and the theology of the day, they were Christian, but they had a form of Christianity known as Arianism. As far as, well, it wasn't a form of Christianity. I don't think we can say it like that, but there were conflicting ideas about the nature of Jesus. So I was saying, like, this is the period of time where dogma and it wasn't really set yet. So Arianism had the idea that Jesus was not the same substance of the Father, but proceeded from the Father. To us today, this seems like a kind of like a minor thing, but this was establishing what the Trinity was going to become. It was very important to these people in the mindset that they had at that time, the consciousness that they had at the time. And so this was very important. But I do have an example here of a mosaic which really shows this a bit, because Jesus is presented differently by Arians and then by Orthodox, what would later become Orthodox Christianity, and you probably won't be able to see this, but just look at these gorgeous mosaics. These still exist in Ravenna. Many have been lost to history, but there is still a gorgeous amount of preserved architecture in these mosaics from this era, so from the around 400s to the 800s. But you probably won't be able to see that, but on this side we have Jesus with a beard. This is the Orthodox, and then on this side we have Jesus that looks like kind of like a boy. No beard, kind of like a boy, because that's the Arian view that Jesus wasn't co-existent, co-equal with the Father, but proceeded from the Father. So I always think that's kind of cool to take a look back in time and history and how people viewed things differently and how they their whole consciousness was a little bit different than ours, actually. Okay, I wanted to bring up Boethius again. So Boethius, still on the topic of Theodoric, the Goth king. So Boethius, I chatted Boethius's book a while back. It's called The Consolation of Philosophy. And Boethius kind of got up in some court drama and court intrigue, really around, part of it was driven by this Arianism. That was always a conflict between the Goths and the other sort of people on the Italian peninsula. And so he ended up getting imprisoned and ultimately executed. But while he was in prison, he wrote this book called The Consolation of Philosophy. I chatted that not long ago. I'll link to it down in the details below if you're interested in that. And then Belisarius, so I mentioned, when I did that little timeline, I mentioned how Constantinople eventually took over the city of Ravenna again in around 540. But Belisarius was a general for Constantinople, the emperor of the Eastern Empire, and was trying to reconquer North Africa from the Vandals, another sort of barbaric tribe that had taken over North Africa. And he did succeed in defeating Carthage from the Vandals. And from that, he actually took the spoils from the Temple of Jerusalem, the Jewish Temple of Jerusalem, that had been taken by Titus back in the year 70. So from Rome, it features in the book Rome and Jerusalem. I talked about it at length in that chat. So again, I'll link to that chat if you're interested. But I just thought that was so cool that in the year 70, these treasures from the temple in Jerusalem were taken from Jerusalem to Rome. And then in the year 533, or later on, the Vandals sacked Rome. I forgot what year. But then they sacked Rome. They took the treasure that was from the Jewish temple to Carthage. And then in the year 533, hundreds of years later, Belisarius, the Eastern emperor, defeats the Vandals and then takes the treasure of the Jewish temple to Constantinople for a procession. I just thought that was so cool. Okay, I'm going to run out of time. There's just so much in this book. Islam, the rise of Islam happens during this time. This is ultimately what causes the influence of Ravenna to decrease. Constantinople is really focused on containing the sort of the Muslim rise of the Muslim as they are conquering different territories like around Syria, and they actually siege Constantinople at this point. This is when the Frankish kings then come to power because Rome enlists the help of the Frankish king Charlemagne in order to counter that. But Ravenna starts to lose influence during this period, but nevertheless we still have this gorgeous architecture and it's still there, and one of these days I am going to go and visit it. I think I'm out of time, so I will leave the chat for Ravenna, capital of empire, Crucible of Europe. I'll leave it there. My next chat is going to be The Way They Fell by Joshua B. Coleman. This is a little novella, kind of a fantasy-ish novella. It was very interesting. I've already finished it, so I will have a chat on this coming up fairly soon. Until next time, take care. Bye.